It was one of those nights where everything seemed to conspire against sleep. My husband, John, was away on a business trip, leaving me alone in our quiet suburban home. The kids were at their grandparents' for the weekend, so the house was unusually silent. I had planned to spend the evening catching up on some much-needed rest, but my thoughts kept drifting back to the man next door, Mike. Mike and I had started our affair a few months ago, a dangerous yet exhilarating distraction from the mundanity of everyday life. We had arranged to meet that night, and despite my initial resolve to break things off, the allure was too strong. The clock read midnight when I finally crawled into bed, my heart pounding with a mixture of guilt and anticipation. I told myself it was the last time, that after tonight I'd put an end to it. But those promises felt hollow in the face of the thrill that Mike brought into my life. I must have dozed off, my sleep fitful and restless. The next thing I knew, I felt cold hands on my body, sending a shiver down my spine. I stirred, half dreaming, assuming it was Mike. He had a key to the back door, after all. "Mike?" I murmured, still half asleep. There was no response, but the hands continued to move over me, their touch unsettlingly cold. I forced my eyes open and saw a shadowy figure looming over me. Panic surged through me, adrenaline jolting me fully awake. The man in my room was not Mike. He was tall, his face obscured by a hood, and his eyes gleamed with a terrifying intent. My heart leapt into my throat as I realized the danger I was in. I tried to scream, but he clamped a hand over my mouth, stifling the sound. "Shoo," he hissed, his voice low and menacing. "If you scream, I'll kill you." Terror froze me in place, my mind racing as I tried to think of a way out. His grip was strong, his hands rough and calloused. I struggled, but he easily overpowered me, pinning me to the bed. "Please," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Please don't hurt me." He chuckled softly, a chilling sound. "It's not up to you," he said, tightening his grip. Desperation took over. I remembered the small, decorative knife John kept in the nightstand drawer, a souvenir from a trip to Japan. I needed to reach it, but the intruder was watching my every move. Thinking quickly, I feigned compliance, relaxing my body and stopping my struggles. His grip loosened slightly, and I saw my chance. With a burst of strength fueled by sheer terror, I twisted my body and lunged for the drawer. He reacted swiftly, grabbing my arm and yanking me back. But I managed to open the drawer just enough to slip my hand inside. My fingers closed around the knife's handle, and I pulled it out, swinging wildly. The blade caught him on the arm, and he yelped in pain, recoiling just enough for me to scramble out of bed. I bolted for the door, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Behind me, I heard him cursing and stumbling after me. I ran down the hall, my mind a blur of fear and frantic thoughts. The house was dark, the shadows seeming to close in around me. I needed to get out, to find help. But the front door was locked, and my keys were in the kitchen. I sprinted for the kitchen, my bare feet slipping on the hardwood floor. Behind me, the intruder was gaining ground, his footsteps heavy and determined. I could hear his labored breathing, the sound sending chills down my spine. I reached the kitchen and grabbed my keys from the counter, fumbling to unlock the back door. My hands were shaking so badly that it took several attempts to fit the key into the lock. Just as I turned the key, he caught up to me, grabbing my shoulder and spinning me around. In the dim light from the window, I saw his face for the first time. It was twisted with rage, his eyes dark and malevolent. He raised his fist, and I braced myself for the blow. Suddenly, there was a loud bang, and the man staggered back, a look of shock on his face. I looked past him and saw Mike standing in the doorway, a gun in his hand. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear and determination. "Get away from her," Mike said, his voice shaking. The intruder turned to face Mike, his expression shifting to one of fury. He lunged at Mike, and they grappled, the gun slipping from Mike's hand and skidding across the floor. I dove for it, my heart pounding in my chest. I grabbed the gun and pointed it at the intruder, my hands trembling. "Stop!" I screamed. "Or I'll shoot." He hesitated, his eyes flicking between me and Mike. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Then, with a snarl, he turned and bolted out the back door, disappearing into the night. I collapsed to the floor, the gun slipping from my hands as sobs racked my body. Mike rushed to my side, his arms wrapping around me in a protective embrace. "It's okay," he whispered, his voice soothing. "He's gone. You're safe now." But I didn't feel safe. The terror of the night's events had left a deep scar, and I knew that nothing would ever be the same. The house that had once been a sanctuary now felt like a prison, the shadows hiding unseen dangers. The police arrived shortly after, their presence a stark contrast to the quiet of the night. They took our statements, searched the house, and assured us they would do everything they could to find the intruder. But their words felt hollow, a weak comfort in the face of such fear. John came home the next day, his concern for me evident in his eyes. I couldn't bring myself to tell him about Mike, about the affair. It seemed insignificant compared to the horror of the previous night. All I wanted was to feel safe again, to forget the cold hands and the malevolent eyes that had invaded my home. When we first moved into the old apartment, we were filled with hope and excitement. The rent was cheap, and even though the building was a bit run down, it had character. It was the perfect place for three friends trying to make it in the city. The peeling paint and rusty fixtures didn't matter, we had each other, and that was enough. Our trio consisted of me, Alex, my best friend since childhood, Jenny, and a guy from work named Mark. Mark worked the late shift at a local diner, so he often came home in the early hours of the morning. He was quiet and a bit brooding, but we got along well enough. Over time, however, I started to notice little things about Mark that made me uneasy. He would watch Jenny and me when he thought we weren't looking, his gaze lingering a bit too long. I chalked it up to him being tired or stressed from work, but the feeling of unease grew. One night, Jenny and I were lounging in the living room, watching a horror movie. We were huddled together on the couch, laughing at our own fear, when Mark came home. The door creaked open, and he stepped inside, his face shadowed by the dim hallway light. "Hey, Mark," Jenny called, her voice cheerful. "Want to join us?" He shook his head, his expression unreadable. "No, thanks," he muttered, heading straight for his room. As he passed by, I noticed the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands were clenched into fists. Something was wrong, but I didn't want to ruin the night by bringing it up. Instead, I turned my attention back to the movie, trying to ignore the gnawing feeling in my gut. The hours passed, and eventually, Jenny fell asleep on the couch. I decided to call it a night and gently woke her up. "Come on, let's get you to bed," I whispered. She mumbled something incoherent and stumbled to her room. I went to the kitchen for a glass of water, the apartment silent and still. As I stood there, I heard a faint noise coming from Mark's room. It sounded like crying. Curiosity got the better of me, and I crept down the hallway, stopping outside his door. The sobbing was clearer now, raw and full of pain. I raised my hand to knock, then hesitated. What if he didn't want to be disturbed? But something compelled me to reach out. "Mark?" I called softly. "Are you okay?" The sobbing stopped abruptly, replaced by a chilling silence. My heart pounded in my chest as I waited for a response. The door creaked open, and Mark stood there, his eyes red and puffy, his face twisted with anger. "What do you want?" he snapped, his voice hoarse. I heard you and thought maybe you needed someone to talk to," I stammered, taking a step back. He stared at me for a moment, his expression darkening. "You think you understand, don't you? But you have no idea what it's like. Watching you two together, always laughing, always happy. While I'm just nothing. His words sent a chill down my spine. "Mark, I didn't mean." "Shut up," he yelled, slamming the door in my face. I stood there, stunned, my mind racing. What was he talking about? Jenny and I were just friends, but did he think there was something more? I decided it was best to leave him alone and retreated to my room, locking the door behind me. Sleep was elusive that night. Every sound, every creak of the old building set my nerves on edge. I couldn't shake the image of Mark's tormented face, his words echoing in my mind. A loud crash jolted me awake. My heart pounded as I listened intently. Another crash, followed by muffled shouting. I jumped out of bed and ran to the living room, my stomach in knots. Mark was standing over Jenny, who was sprawled on the floor, blood dripping from a gash on her forehead. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with terror. "Mark, stop!" I screamed, rushing towards them. He turned to me, his eyes wild. "You think you can just ignore me? Pretend I don't exist?" He brandished a kitchen knife, its blade glinting in the dim light. "Mark, please, put the knife down," I pleaded, trying to stay calm. "We can talk about this." "There's nothing to talk about," he spat, advancing on me. "You're both the same. You don't care about me. You never did." I backed away, my mind racing. I had to get Jenny out of here, but how? She was still conscious but clearly in pain, struggling to get up. Mark lunged at me, the knife aimed at my chest. I dodged to the side, grabbing a lamp and swinging it at him. The lamp shattered against his head, and he staggered back, momentarily dazed. "Jenny, run!" I shouted, helping her to her feet. We bolted for the door, Mark's footsteps pounding behind us. My heart raced as I fumbled with the lock, my hands shaking. Just as I got the door open, Mark grabbed my arm, pulling me back. "You're not going anywhere," he growled, his grip tightening. I kicked at him, desperation fueling my strength. He grunted in pain but didn't let go. Jenny managed to slip past us, running out into the hallway. With one last effort, I twisted out of Mark's grasp and followed Jenny, slamming the door behind me. We ran down the stairs, the old building's walls echoing with our frantic footsteps. We burst out onto the street, gasping for breath. The night air was cold and biting, but it was a relief to be outside, away from the horror that had unfolded in our apartment. We didn't stop running until we reached a nearby convenience store, its fluorescent lights a beacon of safety. We burst inside, the clerk looking up in shock as we collapsed onto the floor, panting and trembling. "Help us," I gasped. "Please, call the police." The clerk dialed 911, his eyes wide with concern. Jenny leaned against me, her breathing ragged. "We're safe now," I whispered, more to reassure myself than her. The police arrived quickly, their flashing lights a welcome sight. They took our statements and went to the apartment to apprehend Mark. An officer stayed with us, asking questions and trying to keep us calm. "It's over," he said gently. "You're safe now." But the words felt hollow. The fear, the terror of that night would stay with us forever. Mark had been our friend, someone we trusted. The betrayal cut deep, leaving scars that would never fully heal. The night of my high school graduation party started like any other celebration, full of excitement, laughter, and the promise of a bright future. The anticipation of moving on from high school and stepping into adulthood filled the air. We gathered at Sarah's house, where her parents had kindly vacated the premises for the evening, leaving us to our youthful revelry. It was there, amidst the noise and chaos of the party, that I met him. His name was Luke, introduced to me by a mutual friend, Kyle. Luke wasn't from our school, he was older, in his mid-20s, with a rugged look and an easy smile that drew people in. I wasn't looking for anything serious, just a bit of fun to celebrate my impending freedom. "Hey, Emily, this is Luke," Kyle said, slinging an arm around his shoulder. He's got some good stuff if you're interested. I wasn't a regular smoker, but tonight felt like a night for breaking the rules. I smiled at Luke, and he returned it with a charm that made my heart flutter just a bit. "Nice to meet you, Emily," he said smoothly. "Want to step outside for a bit?" The party was loud and crowded, so the idea of getting some fresh air sounded appealing. We slipped out into the backyard, where the moon cast a silvery glow over everything. Luke produced a joint, lighting it with practiced ease, and took a long drag before passing it to me. As we smoked, we chatted about everything and nothing. He was a good talker, and I found myself relaxing more than I should have. After a while, the world around me seemed softer, the edges blurring into a comfortable haze. "Let's get out of here," Luke suggested after a while. "Find somewhere quieter." I was hesitant. The party was a safe place, full of familiar faces. But Luke's eyes were persuasive, and the weed had dulled my usual caution. I nodded, and we slipped out the side gate, heading down the darkened street. We walked for a bit, talking and laughing, until we reached the edge of the neighborhood. The night was quiet, the kind of silence that feels almost oppressive. I was starting to feel uneasy, a nagging voice in the back of my mind telling me to go back. "I should probably head home," I said, trying to sound casual. "It's getting late." Luke's demeanor shifted slightly, a shadow crossing his face. "Come on, Emily, don't be like that. We're just having fun." But the unease was growing, spreading through me like ice. "No, really. I need to go." He grabbed my wrist, his grip tight and unyielding. "I'll walk you," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. I pulled my hand away, my heart starting to race. "No, it's fine. I can get home on my own." His eyes darkened, and for the first time, I saw something dangerous lurking beneath his charming exterior. "I insist." I turned and walked quickly back towards the party, my mind racing with fear and regret. I shouldn't have left with him. I shouldn't have been so trusting. I thought I lost him, but as I reached the door of Sarah's house, I glanced back and saw him standing at the end of the driveway, watching me with a look that sent chills down my spine. I hurried inside, locking the door behind me. The rest of the party passed in a blur. I couldn't shake the feeling of his eyes on me, and I decided to leave early, heading home with a group of friends. But even surrounded by people, I couldn't escape the sense of dread that clung to me. When I got home, the house was dark and quiet. My parents were out of town for the weekend, trusting me to handle things on my own. I locked the doors and windows, double-checking everything before heading to my room. I tried to sleep, but every creak and groan of the house set my nerves on edge. I kept seeing Luke's face, his eyes following me in the darkness. I told myself it was just paranoia, the lingering effects of the weed and the stress of the night. But then I heard it, a faint tapping at my window. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The tapping grew more insistent, and I knew it wasn't my imagination. I crept to the window, my hands shaking as I pulled back the curtain. Luke's face stared back at me, his eyes wild and frantic. He was mouthing something, but I couldn't make it out. I backed away, my mind racing. I needed to call the police, but my phone was downstairs. I cursed myself for leaving it there, too terrified to go down and get it. Luke continued to tap on the window, his expression growing more desperate. I had to do something. I grabbed my bedside lamp, holding it like a weapon, and slowly made my way to the door. I crept down the stairs, every step a jolt of fear. When I reached the bottom, I saw the glow of my phone on the kitchen counter. I darted across the room, snatching it up and dialing 911 with trembling fingers. 911, what's your emergency? The operator's calm voice was a lifeline in the darkness. There's a man outside my house, I whispered, my voice shaking. He's trying to get in. Please, send someone quickly. Stay on the line with me, ma'am. Officers are on their way. Can you lock yourself in a room? I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. Yes. I'm going to my bedroom. Good. Stay there until the officers arrive. They'll be there shortly. I ran back up the stairs, locking myself in my room and crouching in the corner, clutching the phone like a lifeline. The tapping had stopped, and the silence was worse. I strained to hear any sound, my breath coming in shallow gasps. Minutes felt like hours, but finally, I heard the sound of sirens in the distance. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. There was a crash downstairs, the sound of breaking glass, and I knew Luke had found a way in. Please, hurry, I whispered into the phone, tears streaming down my face. The operator's voice was calm and reassuring, but it did little to ease my fear. They're almost there. Stay quiet and stay hidden. I heard footsteps on the stairs, slow and deliberate. My heart felt like it was going to explode. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying the police would get here in time. The footsteps stopped outside my door, and I heard the doorknob rattle. Luke's voice was low and menacing. Emily, let me in. We need to talk. I stayed silent, too terrified to move. The door shook as he tried to force it open. Emily. Suddenly, there were shouts from downstairs, the sound of heavy boots on the floor. Luke cursed and the footsteps retreated, followed by a struggle and more shouting. I heard the front door slam and the sound of voices growing louder. I stayed where I was, too scared to move until a voice called up to me. Emily, it's the police. You're safe now. I unlocked the door and stumbled out, my legs shaking. 2 officers were in the hallway, their expressions serious but kind. He's gone, one of them said. We're taking him into custody. Relief and exhaustion washed over me, and I collapsed into their arms, sobbing. They led me downstairs, where I saw Luke being shoved into a patrol car, his face twisted with rage. The officers took my statement, and one of them stayed with me until my parents arrived. The horror of the night slowly faded, replaced by a deep, lingering fear. I knew I would never forget the terror of seeing Luke at my window, the sound of his voice as he tried to break in.